thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having us. Thinking to the experts versus so-called lay citizens in the work that I did for many years on dialogues about various policy issues. One thing I learned was that the so-called lay people always have the most original ideas. The experts, many of us tend to become very, very knowledgeable of certain areas, but not necessarily broader contexts of lived experiences. And so my co-author and I, began thinking a lot about that. We both work with the Red Dot Foundation Global, which works to, it's the largest crowd map on the planet of sexual assault and harassment. And we also are now engaging, trying to engage child sex abuse and other gender-based violence. And the way that we do it is that we go, we collect stories from everyday citizens, people, in the communities who have various experiences with gender-based violence. And those experiences are then put on a map as red dots, hence the Red Dot Foundation Global. And when we see a concentration, most of the work so far has been in India, and a handful of other places, much of it in India. But when we'll see a concentration of cases, that'll become a larger cluster of red dots, or sort of a blob of red dots, if you will. And then we go back into that community and talk with the community members about what's going on, and what could we do about it? What could they do about it? And that has worked very effectively in empowering various communities to change, what's going on, and redirect the track of their community to, be more inclusive of women and girls. We've seen women and girls go back to school. We've seen them be out more times of the day and night, and just, real shifts in the lived experiences of those communities. And that kind of got us thinking about the current moment, not just COVID, which, very much illustrates globally the need for a different approach, more of a evolved approach of diplomacy. The first track of diplomacy being, of course, the various actors acting for their own interests and competing, each nation, to get the most for itself. That clearly won't work in the modern age in terms of the problems that we have to face. Global pandemic, climate change. This is almost certainly a warm up. If this is bad, wait till we have to really deal with climate change as it accelerates. And we're going to have a much more collaborative engagement across the planet. And fortunately, we've been building, as Dr. Camilleri was noting earlier, that we've been developing resources of dialogue groups, facilitators all over the planet. But as was noted in the beginning, they're not always being deployed in effective ways. And I think part of the problem is that we don't have a means for doing that. And we really need, in nations, we need that structure, and we also need it globally. And probably it would be something like the UN that would be able to create that. And I don't think people have thought of that possibility, that we have the technology, we have the means. I think we have the will in many respects. The presentation just prior to mine was fascinating to listen to as someone who grew up here in the States, and has had a lot of involvement with the Black Lives Matter movement for all of my life. And to hear someone be so impacted to change, direct the course of their life half a world away, underscores the value, in dialogue. And I think the value in dialogue is exactly what Dr. Camilleri is talking about. It's listening, it's engaging, it's essentially the means of Max Weber's Verstehen, empathy. When you talk with other people, you hear other stories, and you become more, broader in your understanding, affectively, of what is going on in other parts of the world, and how that might reflect what's going on around you. And so, I think we thought a lot about the current moment, and I think we definitely are in a transitional period. Effectively, this is the sort of, I remember early in my academic career hearing a lot about the postmodern turn and how, we were heading to a world where people would be more empowered and there wouldn't be these big authority figures making decisions for everyone. But of course, you can never really see into the future. Now that we're in the future, we realize that that idea didn't quite work out exactly as planned. We didn't anticipate necessarily the rise of a global internet, and with it, the influence of corporations, marginal and extremist views that now can connect across the planet. Norway, New Zealand, the United States, many different places, much of Europe, have dealt with extremists of, we talk a lot about, Islamic extremists, but the white supremacist extremists are doing exactly the same thing and are just as coordinated in these, with these tools, right? And so that also, however, provides a means for the citizenry around the planet, within countries and across countries, to be engaged in different ways, and activated in similar ways, but for a more productive kind of engagement. And so the problem we think though is that citizens are largely unpracticed in deliberating the various merits, or really before even deliberating, having dialogue to even understand the issues that others are experiencing on the ground in different parts of the world. We read about things, but they're distilled in newspapers. We don't often get to hear from people on the ground, but reliably, we find that when people do hear real stories, and this is why Red Dot works so well, we start with stories of sexual abuse and harassment. And those stories engage people. They engage people in the community. They remind them that they're not alone. And they bring people together to come up with solutions to different problems. But the key is that the solutions come from the community and the people, and not from the governance structures. And as Dr. Vajeo was noting earlier, too often one of the things that short circuits when there are inclinations of various governance structures in much of the world, or at least some of the world, to try to engage more the citizens, but it's largely kind of a theater. It's almost like a when people come together for a town hall meeting, but the people don't ever really get to speak. They often just sit and listen to leaders tell them what's going on. Maybe they get to ask a question. But really, if you're going to engage dialogue, you start with dialogue before you get to the deliberation part, right? And so a lot of municipalities will want to start with the deliberation part. Here are the options, pick one. But in fact, that misses the whole point, which is that everyday people will come up with wildly better solutions than the municipal authorities most of the time. So what they need to be involved in is creating possibilities as they listen to one another and get to really understand the lived experience and how it resonates with their own, and what it looks like for other people. Many times they will come up with really novel, interesting ideas. And so that seems like where we need to start as a community of people who facilitate dialogue and think a lot about dialogue and what it can be, and also various governance structures that could create means for this to become embedded as more of a process of how policy gets made within communities, within nations, and across the planet. And so really, we're interested in hearing more. We kind of have this concept that we wanted to introduce, but really it's a point of starting for a dialogue, even within the dialogue field, of how would we create that. Because I think once you name it and once you kind of put out the vision, people start to make it, if it makes sense. And we're actually connected. We sit on the executive committee over the SDGs at the UN. And we've realized that we are in a position to suggest some different kinds of ideas. The UN is a huge bureaucracy, we've learned, in engaging them, but there's a lot of really creative, good people in there. And so a lot of times you just kind of have to get to the right people to maybe even model how this, might be done. And modeling it then probably increases the odds that it might get replicated. Because I think one thing I learned in facilitating dialogues is people want to come back over and over and over, because there isn't spaces many times for people to come together and just explore ideas with people that often they would never sit down with together. One thing that I would be very mindful of was to try to bring together people with wildly different points of view, to sit with one another and listen, and really hear that other point of view. Because when you're sitting with a person, sharing a meal, they're not this other. The othering diminishes because you're sitting across the table from them, and you start to hear why they think what they think, and you realize they're not crazy or evil or whatever we like to say. They're actually have reasoned ideas just like you. And so then you start to think about, how do we get to some underlying values and connect to come up with some more unique solutions. So thank you very much.